There have been a lot of eyes on Putin following the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, this invasion didn't come out of nowhere. Prior to the war with Ukraine, Putin had already invaded both Crimea and Georgia, along with threatening several other neighboring countries. Russia's aggressive actions since 2008 have been guided by Putin's mission to centralize power and re-establish Russia as a major power on the global stage. And up until this war with Ukraine, Putin was pretty successful. He managed to partially re-establish Russia's global sphere of control while centralizing all political powers in the country in his hands. But to understand how Russia ended up this way, and how Putin managed to achieve this, we have to look at the history. Though Putin played an important role in preventing any democratization of the country, to be honest, Russian democracy was already dead before he took office. In this video, I'm going to examine Russia's transition from communism to democracy and examine what went wrong. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, leave a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel. Anyway, let's get back to the topic at hand. During and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was never truly set up for democracy. Political participation was almost non-existent in the Soviet Union. Civil society, meaning non-governmental organizations run by civilians such as charities, environmental groups, or political parties, were also virtually non-existent during the USSR. Obviously, in Soviet Russia, there wasn't too much popular political participation, and any political participation that did occur was controlled by the government. Greater political participation did begin to emerge in the late 80s, following Gorbachev's reforms, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian civil society was still in its infancy, and political participation from the people, along with civil society, are extremely important to the functioning of a healthy democracy. Without this popular participation, powerful elites under President Yeltsin seized the agenda and used their political power in order to enhance their own status. Following this turn of events, a lot of Russian people turned away from politics and became more apathetic. The dominant political elites of the 90s following the collapse of the USSR were called oligarchs. These oligarchs managed to use the disastrous policy of shock therapy in order to enrich themselves. For those that don't know, shock therapy was the liberalization of the economy that followed after the collapse of the USSR. This was implemented in Russia and many other post-Soviet states. The strategy, developed and promoted by Western economists, was to transfer a planned economy to a market economy through a series of radical and simultaneous economic reforms. A mass privatization of state-owned enterprises occurred, and austerity was implemented. The oligarchs managed to get really rich off of this process by making lucrative deals with the government, trading desperate, starving workers for stock in companies in order to buy the companies up, and by using, frankly, criminal tactics and intimidation. To put it simply, shock therapy was a disaster. Across the post-Soviet world, life expectancy actually dropped, rates of poverty increased sharply, and standards of living plummeted. Basically, the 90s were not a good time for Eastern Europe, at least economically. But in this video, we're not confronting all the consequences of shock therapy, we're simply looking at the political consequences. When shock therapy was implemented following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the new Russian state was very weak and its institutions were underdeveloped. Thus, the liberalization process occurred without much oversight, and those who already had political connections were able to take advantage of it to enrich themselves. Economic power was concentrated into the hands of a few oligarchs, who then translated their wealth into political influence. Some reformers hoped that Russia would eventually transition out of this oligarchic system of capitalism into a more modern liberal system, but that transition has not happened. After the initial chaotic privatization, Yeltsin began working with these newly powerful oligarchs, which just cemented their institutional power. For example, in what we call loans for shares auctions, remaining state-owned enterprises were sold off at bargain prices to politically favored oligarchs. Now, the oligarchs repaid this favor in 1996 when they put their massive wealth behind Yeltsin's re-election campaign, allowing him to defeat a popular competitor. Yeltsin would then serve until 1999, increasingly incompetent due to health issues and his alcoholism, when he was replaced with his hand-picked successor, Vladimir Putin. Clearly, political power in Russia had already been consolidated into the hands of a few powerful oligarchs, with the vast majority of Russians unable to actually influence their own political system. This was due to the chaotic privatization of the country, which was obviously influenced by the government's weak institutions. But even as these institutions developed, they tended to lean more towards autocracy than democracy. The office of the presidency is actually the best and most relevant example of this. Though Yeltsin was the leader of the democratization movement in the USSR, he did not do a great job of democratizing newly independent Russia. His style of rule was not very democratic. Yeltsin used his clout, being the main dissident of the Soviet Union, in order to rule Russia by decree, instead of by consultation with the majority. Yeltsin attempted to rule as an autocrat, which brought him into constant conflict with the Russian parliament. He also failed to effectively transition from the institutions and elites of the USSR. As previously mentioned, many of the oligarchs who arose in the 90s were men who already had political connections in the Soviet Union. And all of these issues would get worse as the 90s continued. Sick of Congress challenging his power, in 1993, Yeltsin proposed implementing a new constitution that would further centralize power in the hands of the president. He was feeling bold following a referendum in the same year in which a majority of voters said that they had confidence in Yeltsin. Of course, most countries wouldn't accept a simple vote of confidence in order to completely rewrite their country's constitution. So Congress refused to endorse Yeltsin's blatant power grab, upon which he issued Presidential Decree 1400, which illegally dissolved the parliament and called for new elections. Of course, the Russian Congress rejected this decree and refused to dissolve, instead declaring Yeltsin unfit to rule and attempting to remove him from power. With the two sides basically at a stalemate, a political crisis emerged, with protests and violent clashes occurring in the streets of Moscow. In response, Yeltsin did what I'm sure any good democratic leader would do. He mobilized the army. He rolled tanks up to the parliament building, shelled it, and then proceeded to forcefully occupy it. Following this show of force, the opposition collapsed, and the First Russian Republic collapsed along with it. In the aftermath of the 1993 coup, Yeltsin went forward with implementing his new constitution, which, as previously mentioned, consolidated major political power in his own hands. In his system, the president was given a lot of control over the legislature, being granted the power to both appoint the prime minister and other important cabinet offices. The judiciary technically remained independent, though in practice Yeltsin packed the courts with his supporters. This style of government is often referred to as a super-presidential system. Yeltsin's power grab combined with the crisis of 1993 really shook the faith of the Russian public in democracy. In response, people started to withdraw from politics altogether, becoming apathetic and eventually cynical. And though the Russian economy would improve throughout the 90s, this is basically the political situation Putin found himself in when he was appointed as Yeltsin's successor in 1999. Though he would further consolidate power and cripple the opposition, Putin was simply continuing the work that Yeltsin had started. Yeltsin created this authoritarian super-presidential system and passed it down to Putin to use as he wished. Through political maneuvering, repression, and some genuine popularity due to the improvement of the Russian economy, Putin has managed to trample any chance democracy had at re-emerging in Russia. And this is how we've ended up with the situation we see today, where Putin can basically run the country as he sees fit. So, to summarize what we've learned today, why did democracy fail in Russia? The corrupt and chaotic liberalization of the economy led to the empowerment of economic elites named oligarchs. These oligarchs parlayed their wealth into political power, at a time when average Russians were falling ever deeper into poverty. At the same time, the champion of the Russian democratic movement, Boris Yeltsin, became increasingly authoritarian as he took the office of the president. Following a violent confrontation with parliament, he reorganized Russia's political system, concentrating massive amounts of power in his own hands. The Russian people, unable to truly influence their politics, fell into apathy, eventually almost completely withdrawing from political life. When Putin took over, he simply leveraged this pre-existing situation to further increase his power and wealth. Basically, democracy failed due to disastrous economic policies, along with corrupt and greedy elites. Hey, what's new, right? On a serious note, I do think it's really unfortunate that it's worked out this way. I mean, it's not good for the people of Russia, and it's definitely not good for the people of surrounding countries, particularly the people of Ukraine. Hopefully this can be a learning moment if Russia ever gets another chance to democratize, if we see the fall of Putin one day, or if any other countries find themselves in a similar situation. Make sure to gradually build up strong institutions and mobilize popular participation before making radical economic and political changes. Also, maybe institutions like the IMF and the Western countries that control them shouldn't force disastrous neoliberal policies on countries that are desperate for international aid. Just a thought. You can draw your own conclusions, but the history is what it is. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this video, I would once again appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, leave a like on the video, and subscribe to my channel. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will hopefully see you guys again next time. Goodbye.